welcome to today's discussion brought to you by Class Unity Political Education Committee. Our guest today is Brett Christophers. He is a professor at Uppsala University in Sweden and author of numerous books, including Rentier Capitalism and The New Enclosure. His most recent book is Our Lives and Their Portfolios, Why Asset Managers Own the World, out now published by Verso Books. So Professor Christophers, welcome, and thank you for talking with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's lovely to be with you. I'm just going to talk for 10, 15 minutes or so about the book and I guess kind of where it came from, what I was trying to achieve with it, just a very kind of high level overview, and then we can take it from there. So the book very much kind of grew, I would say, more or less organically out of the Rentier Capitalism book, which itself actually grew more or less organically out of the New Enclosure book. While I was doing the New Enclosure work, much of that book was about the emergence and growth of a new kind of class of land rentiers, for want of a better label, in the UK in recent decades, as partly as a result of the large-scale privatization of land in the UK. And when I was working on that book and thinking about contemporary British capitalism more broadly, one thing that struck me was that the basic kind of economic structures and dynamics that I was describing in relation to land appeared to me to be kind of replicated across other sectors of the economy. So sure, the particular asset that might be involved was different, wasn't necessarily land, but across the economy, I kept seeing the same sort of patterns of activities that were about securing proprietarial control over over assets, doing everything that could be done to render those assets as scarce and as monopolistically ring-fenced as possible, and then making money from controlling rights to the access and use of those particular assets. And so that was what Rentier Capitalism was about this kind of just thinking about the kind of core rentier model and how it was replicated across the economy more generally, and not just in relation to land. And then while I was working on that book, and looking at rentier dynamics across the British economy as a whole, in relation to land, sure, but also finance and infrastructure, digital platforms, natural resources, a whole host of other things, I kept coming across, when I was looking at who the particular rentier institutions were, that were dominant in each sector of the economy, I kept coming across a particular type of investment institution, which of course was asset managers, about whom I didn't know an awful lot at the time. But I kind of, while I was working on the Rentier Capitalism, I kind of saw that and parked it and thought, right, I want to come back to this, because my interest was piqued by the fact that I kept coming across the likes of Blackstone and Macquarie and others, and that led me to ask the question, well, why am I seeing a particular type of actor that maybe I hadn't expected to see as being so prevalent, so recurring so much across all these different asset types within the British economy. So that was where the book came from. And as I began to do more research into that question, I think one of the things I became interested in was the fact that there is now more and more being written about asset management institutions. But one thing that struck me was that, at least within the kind of academic sphere with which I'm most familiar, although I don't think only there, I think within broader commentary as well, so much of the focus has been upon the big big very, very, very large scale index fund managing firms, the likes of BlackRock and Fidelity and State Street and so on, and about the fact that they now have this kind of universal ownership of relatively small shares of pretty much every corporation. And while I think that that's definitely interesting and important, it struck me that this kind of whole other corner of the asset management business, where they're not hugely diversified and owning minority stakes in tens of thousands of companies, but they're taking active ownership, not so much of financial assets, but of real assets, physical assets, on which the likes of you and I and just ordinary folks more generally, to a significant extent, rely when going about their everyday lives. That struck me as something interesting and original that wasn't being written about. So that was what the book focused on. It's about that phenomenon. It's about control of housing and various types of essential infrastructure by asset managers like Blackstone. And really, I think I was, at the end of the day, I was trying to do a bunch of, I think, relatively straightforward things. With the book, it's not an especially theoretical book. I think it's very much an empirically driven book. And really, it was about trying to do a number of different things. So one of those was simply to kind of try to get some kind of handle on the scale of the phenomenon and on its geography. So, it was quite immediately apparent that asset managers, as owners of these types of assets, are much more significant in some parts of the world than in others. And then actually within particular countries or particular regions, they're much more dominant in some areas than in others. So getting a handle on the scale of the phenomenon was something that I wanted to do, and which in many ways was kind of the most challenging thing, precisely because so much of this business takes place behind a kind of curtain or wall of secrecy, very limited disclosure requirements. When asset managers buy and sell these types of assets using the types of investment funds that they do use, which tend to be domiciled in tax havens. And so just actually figuring out what's going on empirically was quite a significant challenge. So first of all, getting a handle on the scale of the fund. Secondly, and this was something that became more and more important during the project, as I realized that it is today an extremely significant phenomenon, and that it's a phenomenon that has grown particularly strongly over the past 15 years or so. So especially since the period of the global financial crisis. So sure, asset managers were buying housing and buying infrastructure before that, but the level of investment in those types of assets kind of went into overdrive after the financial crisis. So trying to understand, pretty basic things like, what is it about these types of assets that make them attractive investment propositions for asset managers, and why growth in that type of investment kind of took off after the global financial crisis. And then I suppose that the last, but in many ways, obviously the most important thing I was trying to get to grips with in the work and in the book that resulted from it was, what are the kind of implications of this? And in particular, I was interested in the implications I was interested in the implications for the asset managers themselves as capitalist institutions. I was certainly interested in the phenomenon from the perspective of the state, partly because many of these types of assets in many countries were assets that historically have been under significant levels of public ownership in many countries. So to one extent or another, asset managers have replaced governments as owners of and stewards of some of these types of assets, not all of them, but certainly some of them. And then also from the state's perspective, what also became clear is that governments play a very, very significant role in sort of shaping the terms and conditions under which investment in these types of assets occurs. So to not put it too crudely, doing all sorts of kind of preparatory legal and financial work to make these assets things that asset managers do want to invest in, things that they would consider investable. Governments play a very significant role in that as well. But then probably most important of all, I was interested in trying to think about the implications of this phenomenon for ordinary people, and I mean that in two different respects. So first of all, and most importantly, ordinary people as those who rely upon many of these types of assets when going about their daily lives. So people that live in the housing that's owned by asset managers, whether that's multifamily housing or student accommodation or care homes or even mobile home communities. The people that park in the parking systems owned by asset managers, that pay for the electricity that is delivered through the grid owned by asset managers, and so on and so forth. So, and that's the prime reference, I suppose, of the subtitle of the book. So when the book says, sorry, of the title of the book, not the subtitle of the book. So our lives in their portfolios. What I principally mean by that is literally that our lives are embedded in physical assets that are now significant investments within the investment portfolios of asset managers. So first of all, as ordinary people in their role as users of these types of assets, and then secondly, and I think also very, very importantly, ordinary people as owners to one extent or another of the capital that gets invested in the funds that buy these assets. And what I mean there is principally, although not exclusively, but certainly principally, the retirement savings of ordinary people, which increasingly in the last couple of decades have been invested via asset managers, and increasingly have been invested by those asset managers in housing and infrastructure rather than in financial assets, other forms of real estate, and so on. So that's, I guess, what I was trying to do with the book, and I think what emerges from the book is a pretty negative picture of the role of these asset managers, a pretty negative picture of the implications of this phenomenon for ordinary people. So asset managers themselves, one of their kind of main lines of defense against criticism is to say, look, what we're doing by owning and controlling and looking after these types of assets is actually good for ordinary people. It's good for ordinary people because we are better, more efficient, leaner, more responsive stewards of things like housing and critical infrastructure than other types of owners, and particularly than public sector owners of these types of assets. And what we do is also good for ordinary people, because if our investment funds that invest in these types of assets perform well financially, then the ultimate beneficiaries of that are ordinary retirement savers whose pensions we're ultimately investing. So school teachers, firefighters, nurses, and so on. And I like to think of the book as being, in significant part, a kind of riposte to that rhetoric, which at the end of the day is very, very misleading, in both of those key respects. So I think that's all I'll say by way of introduction. I'm guessing I've done somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. So hopefully that was around about the right amount and round about that the kind of right level of generality. But needless to say, I'd be very happy to field all in any questions that you might have, and whether that's specifically about the book, whether it's related to stuff in the earlier two books that I mentioned, or indeed if it's questions about asset managers that I don't necessarily address in the book. I think, there's lots of stuff to say about asset managers, some of their private equity operations, the role of the big three index fund managers that I don't address in the book, but I'm happy to discuss those as well. So wherever you want to take it, I'll do my best.
Sure, well, thank you. Yeah, I guess to begin, I mean, one of the questions we had was, how do you think your work relates to classical political economy, including up to Marx's Capital? And I think we asked this particularly in regards to the concept of the rentier, and the role that plays in contemporary capitalism. Because if the classical political economists thought that capitalism was removing us from the rent system of the previous feudal eras, it sounds like from your description that we're just returning to a kind of rentier-based economy. And I wonder how you understand that with regards to classical political economy.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. I think the way I would answer that, or at least to start to answer it, would be to say that what I'm not doing in this book, and what I didn't do in the rentier capitalism book, is what I think some people maybe thought I was doing when they saw the title of the rentier capitalism book. So what that book and this book does not argue is that quote unquote rentier capitalism represents a kind of a new form or modality of capitalism that has succeeded another form of capitalism which was not rentierist. So that's not what either book argues. I think the better way to put what I've been trying to say is that I would argue that capitalism always and everywhere has rentier dimensions throughout history, and indeed that I think that all forms of income generated by capitalist firms has rentier elements, even if in some cases those elements are very, very minimal, if one understands and defines rent in the way that I do in the rentier capitalism book, which is as income that's generated by virtue of control of scarce assets of one type or another. So I think that I would argue that rent is inherent to capitalism, but what I tried to make in the rentier capitalism book is that capitalism since around the 1970s, and particularly British capitalism since around the 1970s, has seen the kind of the rentier dimension, the rentier component, whatever terminology or figurative conceptualization one wants to use, that rentier component has become much more prevalent, much more dominant during that period. So rent has kind of come to the fore, but that's not to say that we have kind of a new form of capitalism. For me, at least, it means that capitalism is capitalism for me. But the kind of shades within what we understand as capitalism change over time, and I think they change in ways that are readily explicable. I think in the UK case, for example, it's there are lots of different explanations for why rent and rentiers have become so much more high profile, so much more significant in recent decades. So I think, and the question of how that relates to classical political economy, I guess I would, and this won't surprise you at all, I guess I would align, if I'm going to talk about kind of who, the kind of tradition in which I situate myself, I suppose it would be with people like Lefebvre and Harvey, who have always made that case that, look, rent and rentiers didn't disappear with the development of 20th and now 21st century capitalism in perhaps the ways that some people might have thought they would, and indeed in ways that you might imagine they had from some readings of political economy in the 20th century, which actually paid relatively little heed to rent and land and so on. Lefebvre and Harvey have always pushed against that and said, look, if we want to have a realistic reading of contemporary capitalism, we have to place the rentier and rent much more centrally to the story than many political economists have wanted to do. Does that help answer the question of how I see this fitting into a kind of that historiography?
Oh yes, very much so. Daniel or Hef, anyone else would like to jump in with a question?
Yeah, sure. I have a question which kind of follows up on that. So I really enjoyed the book because it is very accessible and straightforwardly written, very clear about these things, and very concrete. So I guess my question, I kind of want to back up a little bit and get your view on some more abstract things like the previous question, about how you understand classes and how we should understand class. And especially as it relates to the sort of, the key terms that you use in this discussion and that are important for rentier capitalism and for asset manager society, which are fantastic terms you coined, I think, there. So in traditional Marxism, we got this narrative that, feudalism was vanishing. All the old classes were gradually being done away with until there was the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And it was a sort of dualistic picture. And all that remains is, those who work but don't get the proceeds of production, and those who don't work but do. And profit and wages are the only term there. Ownership and control are assumed to be the same thing, in the hand of the capitalist. It's kind of a caricature, but that's what it was. Similarly, there's a common sense picture that you have, employees and employers. There isn't, and the difference is one of degree in income. And even in mainstream economics, the difference between profit and rent kind of got obliterated, and everything is kind of indistinguishable from returns on investment. There is no more profit of enterprise like Marx talked about in mainstream theory, aggregate profit, surplus value. So I'm just wondering, you present the material in a very, low altitude, no nonsense way, but it seems like simmering underneath there is a radically different picture of classes. Namely, we have owners, controllers, and workers, it seems. And so I was just wondering if you could sort of unpack the conception of class that you use, specifically, like with an eye to these distinctions, which I think are usually neglected. The difference between profit and rent, or capitalist and rentier, ownership and control. It seems like there's a lot going on in the background there.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, that's a good question, and it's a question to which, unfortunately, I do not have a good answer. I think mainly, but for a couple of reasons. I think so. Partly because, I haven't committed the time and effort to thinking and kind of backing out from what I've written what that argument, in a sense, presupposes about changes in class relations under contemporary capitalism. And part of that is, I think, is a recognition that that frankly that's not where my own strengths lie. It's just there's people that are better at doing that type of work than I am. I think the one place where I have tried to kind of at least dabble in those questions. So I wrote a piece a couple of years ago about class and assets and rentier capitalism, which was I don't think it was great, but what I did try to do was I tried to take some of Eric Olin Wright's work about so his thinking about classes and how we define them in terms of their relations to productive assets, basically. And what I tried to do was a sort of a similar thing for the relations of workers to quote unquote unproductive assets. So how are various types of workers situated vis-a-vis assets like digital platforms, assets like housing, assets like infrastructure, assets like oil and gas. And what I tried to do was to think in a relatively straightforward way about how we can perhaps think systematically about different types of relations to those assets on the part of workers. So are they workers who are involved in acquiring those assets for companies? Are they workers who are involved in, for example, the legal regulatory work that is to do with shoring up the private property rights that attach to those assets and rendering them income producing? Or are they the workers that are going out, for example, fixing the pipes and maintaining the properties, quote unquote, sweating those assets and maintaining those assets? And so that's the only real work I've tried to do there, was to try to begin to think in a relatively speculative, but also I think somewhat systematic way about the question of class in relation to quote unquote unproductive assets rather than productive assets. I guess the other thing that I haven't mentioned there, but I think which is kind of obvious, I suppose, which I did address in the rentier capitalism book, but which I don't address in the asset manager book, is to kind of take on actively the fact that a lot of these rent generating assets in certain sectors, and housing would be the obvious one, but it's not the only one, are owned by households rather than by capitalist corporations, and to at least gesture to the question of what that might mean in class terms. And actually, I've it's obviously not a Marxian notion, but I found Piketty's notion of the kind of what he calls petit rentiers, but I thought that was quite useful, because I think that what he describes in his book, and what he talks about there is that, as I'm sure you will know, is he talks about societies having gone from 100 years ago having a very, very small number of very, very, very wealthy rentiers to now there actually being quite in many countries like the UK, like France, and also I suppose like the US, although maybe to a lesser extent, you have actually a relatively large number of quote unquote petit rentiers who might own one or two investment properties or so on. And that, for sure, that's another complication, another wrinkle in classical understandings of class structures, right? Not least because, you know, I think a country like Australia would be a great example of this. Very many of those people, not all of them, of course, but very many of those people are not people who are wealthy in income, in kind of employment income terms. They're and I think that the Konings and Adkins book on the asset economy is quite good on this point. You know, they're people for whom income from property has become their primary source of income, and they're not people who are high earners in terms of waged income. And so it does, I think that's another way in which the idea of rentier capitalism, I think, does confuse classical class conceptions. So as I say, I tried to my best to sort of at least gesture in that direction in that article and a little bit in the rentier capitalism book. But I don't go there in the new book. And as I say, I think, you know, as much as anything, it's and this will sound like an unsatisfactory answer, but this is the truth. It's increasingly a recognition of where my relative strengths lie as a scholar, right? I mean, one thing we all realize as we grow up is we're not all good at everything. And one thing and in fact, sometimes we're not all good at anything. But one of the things I've tried to do as I've spent more time as a writer and as an academic is to say, well, come on, to the extent that I'm good at anything, what is it that I'm good at? And what I've realized is I'm not really a theorist, even if I perhaps in the past had aspirations to being a theorist. But I think what I'm quite good at is taking what can appear quite complex worlds, particularly around finance, around questions of finance, that are often rendered even more opaque than they actually are, but not least by other academics, and of course by practitioners within those worlds themselves, and trying to render those worlds both accessible but also interesting to people who don't know much about those worlds. And I've realized that's something I can actually do reasonably well. So that's where I've increasingly focused, and that's what I guess that's what I was trying to do in this book. But I hear where you're coming from with the question, but I can't do better by way of an answer than that.
So maybe we should zero in on one of the concepts you develop in your book around the contemporary economy. You coined the term asset manager society in distinction from asset manager capitalism. And I do confess this distinction confused me a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate on these terms, and particularly what their significance is in terms of recent history since 2008, just the past couple of decades.
Yeah, I mean, so partly this is positioning. So partly this is what I guess many writers, especially many academics, do, which is to say, I'm doing something different here from those that use that have been discussing asset managers and have been using this idea of asset management capitalism. Look, I'm using a different term, and that is a way for me to signal to you that I'm doing different. So partly it's positioning, but there's certainly more to it than that. So, as I'm sure you know, but just so we can be sure that I'm on the same page as you all are, asset manager capitalism is a concept that, on my reading, people are using to refer to a particular type of asset management company, first and foremost, and to a particular form of influence that those particular asset managers wield today. So the discussions that come under that header focus predominantly on the big index fund managing asset managers, the likes of BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Fidelity, and others. And as I said, and as I alluded to earlier, and to the fact that across major publicly listed financial markets in general, but equity markets in particular around the world, but especially in the US, pretty much every listed company has those big 3 or 4 asset managers as relatively significant shareholders. And I'm sure you've all seen the data. So on average, an S&P 500 company, somewhere around 20 to 22% of the shares in those companies on average is owned by BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street between the 3 of them. And the gist of that work within that literature has been to ask the question, well, what does it mean for contemporary capitalism that the ownership of capital at large has changed in that way, such that entities which 30 or 40 years ago were immaterial in terms of their holdings of shares of big capital have now become the largest shareholders. So what does that mean? And I think a lot of that literature is about questions of corporate governance. It's in the kind of tradition of Gardner and Means and those and back to Hilferding. There's vestiges of that there as well. So it's a literature that has been very much focused on ownership of capital and what that means for control of capitalist corporations and the role of those different types of shareholders, what type of influence they have, how they wield that influence, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason I use a different term is precisely because I think, and I actually argue this very, very briefly in the book, my view is that those questions are actually they're important questions, but I think that they're, for the most part, relatively distant from most people's everyday lives. I think for most people in the world, I'm not convinced, or at least I'm yet to be convinced, that it makes a huge amount of difference whether the shares of S&P 500 companies are, whether 20 to 22% of them are owned by a whole series of different index funds managed by BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard, rather than being held by smaller asset managers or by pension fund trustees directly, and insurance fund treasurers directly, and so on. I think they're important questions, but I think they're relatively distant from most people's everyday lives. Whereas, in my view, if Blackstone owns your house and owns the toll road on which you drive to work and sets the terms and conditions and costs under which you have access to those different assets and the physical conditions in which those assets exist, I would argue that they are much closer to and much more significantly engaged with people's everyday lives and therefore social life, hence asset manager society, than other types of asset managers are in terms of their ownership in a relatively passive fashion of financial assets. So that's why I wanted to use a different term, and that's why I use the particular term I do, to signal that what I'm interested in is I think a pretty different corner of the asset management world. They're all asset managers, but the reality is that, if you look at a company like BlackRock, which does do a very small part of its business is the type of business that I analyze in this book, and that's a completely different part of its business than its index fund business. They work in completely different ways, and I wanted to signal that, and so I didn't want to use the terms that others are using. But of course, and because I can see the kind of objections coming up. Of course, what I'm talking about in the book is of course it's capitalism, and it's a form of capitalism that is led by asset managers. So yes, there's a I realize that there are no clean distinctions in the way that maybe the terminology suggests there is, but nonetheless, I think it's a useful distinction to make.
Anyone have a question? I'm happy to ask, but if Dan or Zach or have something they'd like to say.
Yeah, I have a I have a question.
Okay, go for it.
So I love the book. I thought the stuff about the climate crisis was really interesting, kind of these companies moving into that space and the state kind of taking this backseat, like we'll do risk management and that's it. I was wondering during the pandemic, there was like a lot of bankruptcies in like shale oil companies in the US. Now, do these companies that are building all this green infrastructure and stuff, do they immediately just go into that area too? I mean, I know it's like not an ideological thing for them, it's opportunistic, but do they have like, okay, we have our expertise and our momentum is going in this green direction? Or is it just like, hey, whatever comes up next, we're going for that? Like if there's big opportunities and buying up huge numbers of shale oil companies declaring bankruptcy, are they gonna, be in front of the fracking?
It's a very good question. I mean, I don't know the specifics of what happened in the shale oil sector. So the answer to that question that I'll give you will be guided by an interview I did a couple of years ago with an asset management firm, a very small one, that focuses on the energy sector. And the thing that was really, really interesting in that coming out of that conversation. So this was an asset manager who that historically has run funds that are focused, or at least were, because I'm talking about the past, that were focused predominantly on fossil fuels, so oil and gas exploration, particularly in Texas and in the Gulf of Mexico. And I was when I was talking to this asset manager, I was interested in the question of what types of funds they're trying to raise now, which is to say, what were they raising funds for investment in, and B, what their customers, their traditional clients, the pension funds, the insurance companies, and so on, what types of discussions they're having with those guys in the context of the climate crisis. And the thing that was really interesting to me coming out of that conversation, and whether you can generalize, how far you can generalize from this discussion, I don't know. But what they were saying to me was that they were still desperate to continue to invest in oil and gas. They believed that the future for oil and gas investment, this was maybe 2 years ago, that the future for oil and gas investment remained very bright, not least because of demand in places of the world other than the West. China, India, Indonesia, other countries. So they saw, and I would say see, the future of oil and gas investment as being very bright. But their clients, the big pension schemes and so on, were, according to the person I spoke to, increasingly reluctant to give them money to invest. So they were kind of, whereas in the past they would have no problem raising, a $500 million fund for investing in oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, they were struggling with the fact that that their traditional reliable customers no longer wanted to give them money to do that. And so in that particular case, the asset management firm was, in the words you use, just kind of following the money, basically. but they were to a certain extent finding themselves constrained by the desire of their traditional clients to move away from that type of investment. And I think, you know, we've seen all of those sorts of questions play out very vividly with BlackRock over the last year in the US, where on the one hand you have people on the left saying, you know, nasty BlackRock, still invested in oil and gas companies, whereas you have people on the right saying nasty BlackRock, you know, being woke and trying to put money into renewables, and they're kind of between a little bit between a rock and a hard place. I mean, I'm not expressing sympathy for them, but that's kind of where they're at. And the Inflation Reduction Act was a real boon for them, because it enabled someone like Larry Fink to say to the people on the, you know, he could say to the people on the left, look, we are investing in renewables, and they are investing. But they could also say to the people on their critics on the right, they could say, look, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, we're able to do renewables investment, actually earn pretty healthy returns. So you don't have to worry about us, kind of the idea of us sacrificing financial returns on the altar of sustainability. So I think those are those questions are going to remain completely central going forward. I mean, the only other thing I would say is I would reiterate what one of the main arguments of the book in this context, which is that everywhere you look, or at least everywhere I look in the world, at least in the West, however you want to define that, I think it's almost universally the case that governments who fully recognize that there is enormous infrastructure investment required in the climate context, whether that's for mitigation or adaptation purposes, that those very same governments pretty much universally have decided that government themselves shouldn't be carrying out that investment, even in countries like the US or the UK, where fiscal constraints are obviously imagined as much as they are real, and insofar as they have persuaded themselves that governments cannot and should not carry out the bulk of that investment themselves, and therefore it must be the private sector that does that, then I think it's almost inevitable that they turn to asset managers. Because if you look around the world at, you know, where surplus private capital is held and where it circulates, well, it circulates predominantly among asset management firms and sits as dry powder in their investment funds. So to me, it seems completely inevitable that asset managers are going to play an increasingly central role within the climate crisis, in exactly the same way they are in the housing crisis. To the extent that the answer to the housing crisis is new construction, governments around the world, and Ireland would be a classic case of this, but also the UK, New Zealand, Australia, they all see asset managers as the answer, even though asset managers clearly aren't the answer. They see asset managers as the answer because they think, well, that's where all the capital is. And as you say, governments have for the most part, have restricted their own role to a risk management role.
I mean, this just strikes me, the book in general it paints an incredibly pessimistic future, kind of regarding these major pressing problems. And if the idea of a green transition is sort of one of the major pillars of left-wing policy these days, what does it mean to say that by pushing green infrastructure, we're really just handing infrastructure to asset manager society to control for us? I mean, what should the left-wing critique be here?
Well, I mean, just to respond to the first point, I think it is a very pessimistic picture. But I think it's a picture that it's very hard not to end up with when you think about these questions, and you think about the infrastructure investment requirements, and you think about where governments are at ideologically in terms of questions of borrowing and spending. What should the left be doing? I mean, I think that I think there are several different parts to that answer. I mean, I think that the left should be doing what at least some parts of the left clearly are doing in the US, much more successfully, I guess, than in the UK, which is pushing public ownership of renewables. And you know, there have been some, albeit relatively modest, victories in not least in New York, for example, which have pushed that argument. I mean, clearly there is a role for better regulation of private ownership of infrastructure. I don't think regulation is ever going to be the complete answer. Regulation's never going to kind of successfully stand in for competition in natural monopoly sectors in the way that ideologues originally suggested it would, and regulators get captured, and people in the UK where I'm from, people have been saying, well, regulation can do the job for 30 or 40 years now, and it plainly hasn't done the job in any of the privatized utility infrastructure sectors in the UK. I think the left should be saying, insofar as it's our retirement savings that are being invested via asset managers, we don't necessarily want our money invested in things like rental housing, where essentially our money is enabling pretty explicit exploitation of tenants by asset managers who are hiking rents. And so I think the left can be much more active about what happens in terms of the investment of worker capital, for want of a better phrase. And I think they should be saying that there are certain things that probably shouldn't be owned by asset managers and their short-term investment funds. I think it's a legitimate thing to say these types of funds shouldn't be owning certain types of assets. So I think that there are things they can say and do, but I think for me the first of those is by far the most important. I personally find it very hard to see, and I've long found it very hard to see a positive future for housing and housing access and housing affordability in a place like the UK without a substantially renewed role for public ownership of housing. I just don't see. There are all sorts of other things you can do around the edges, but to me that's an absolute necessity, and it's so far from being a likelihood at the moment that it does look pessimistic, I think, in that sense.
Hef, go ahead.
I think you mentioned one way for, I guess, the left to combat what's going on here. One, by regulating what assets asset management firms can hold. I think that would have to be at the national level, I suppose. And it's an international phenomenon, because you say it's, these companies have holdings, have funds of assets all over the world.
Yep.
It also affects people locally, and very often it's local municipal governments entering into contracts with Blackstone and these
Correct.
other firms.
Yep.
So what level of resistance do you think would be most promising or effective or doable if somebody said, Blackstone owns my house and I I want to do something about it, what would you recommend to them?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. By which I mean that it's really, really difficult for that individual to do much of anything about it. And I think part of the reason for that is precisely the fact that that it's such a smart business model in some ways, by which I mean that it's actually not Blackstone that owns it, right? So Blackstone establishes a fund, which is just a collective investment vehicle, and the fund, almost all the money in the fund is not Blackstone's, maybe 1%, 2%. And so actually, even if it's a Blackstone controlled fund that owns the house in which that particular person lives, the house is actually owned, in terms of who the beneficiary owners are, by, well, ultimately, to a significant extent, the likes of you and I, and even the person who lives in that property themselves. And the asset manager is a mere intermediary, functionally. And sure, it's an intermediary who has established this business in such a way that they are able to extract an outsized share of any financial gains that investment generates. But precisely because they are an intermediary, they are able to turn around when criticism is mounted of their business and say, well, look, you do anything about this, you're just harming the ordinary workers whose money we are putting to work. And as I say in the book, that's a really misleading discourse, because actually those ordinary individuals actually don't see much of the gains at all. But that's a pretty involved argument to make. And so I think part of the kind of beauty of the business from the perspective of the asset managers themselves is that it's a very hard thing to attack, because it's not like one actor owning something. You can just say, because it's one actor bringing to bear a whole sort of investment constellation in a way that I think has kind of spread its tentacles around our society in a way that you kind of have to chop off all those arms at the same time, which I think is very, very hard to do. And I think I think any sort of loosening of the hold of asset managers over the various types of assets that they ultimately control today, it would take a lot of work by a lot of people and a lot of institutions. It's taken quite a long time to come into being, and I think it would take quite a long time for it to be undone, for all the reasons I've just highlighted. Not to mention the fact that, as I'm sure you all have noticed, it doesn't tend to be the chief executives of Goldman Sachs and of JP Morgan and the like who have the ear of government in places like the US these days. It tends to be the chief executives of Blackstone and BlackRock who have the ear of government, and who fund the leaders of both, the campaigns of the leaders of both main parties. So that's just another thing to remember about the kind of the strength of that hold that those asset management companies currently have.
Can you say a little bit more about the relation between asset manager society and the role of the state and government? And I guess particularly like financial policy and things like quantitative easing. I mean, in the United States since 2008, I don't know how many trillions of dollars have been issued through quantitative easing. How does this enable and support the asset market?
Yeah, I mean, as is well known, the financial the financial policy, particularly monetary policy, but also fiscal policy, but certainly monetary policy that we saw across the global north, but particularly in the US in the period following the financial crisis, was very beneficial to asset owners of all types, insofar as it, as lots and lots of research has shown, bolstered asset prices and therefore was very, very beneficial to the owners of assets. Asset managers obviously included, but not only asset managers. But I think, and this kind of goes back to something I was mentioning earlier, I think the other thing to remember about monetary policy is that monetary policy, insofar as it led to a period of unprecedentedly low interest rates for a long period of time in the decade or so after the financial crisis, had a huge impact on the relative desirability of different classes of assets for investment institutions, including asset managers, but not only asset managers. And so as I said in the book, although I probably didn't say as much about this as I should have done, for investors who had historically relied on investing in bonds to secure an annual yield of 4, 5, 6% or whatever it was, in a very low interest rate environment, they could no longer rely upon bonds to deliver that annual income that lots of investors want. So lots of investors aren't just interested in capital gains, they do want a regular annual income. And bonds historically have provided that relatively predictably. And that was precisely one of the main reasons that we saw this surge in investment in things like housing and infrastructure in the period following the financial crisis, because for investors who no longer could get that 4 or 5% predictable yield from bonds, housing and infrastructure were able to supply that regular annual income, plus the possibility of capital gains. And so that was why a lot of money moved out of fixed income financial securities into real assets in the period following the financial crisis. So monetary policy was absolutely central to the flowering, so to speak, of asset manager society after the financial crisis, and of course to the growth in the value of the assets that circulate within asset manager society. And I don't necessarily need to get into any detail, but fiscal policy has always been very, very important as well. So low taxation of assets, low taxation of wealth is obviously happy breeding ground for asset managers insofar as they invest in these types of assets. So monetary policy is absolutely central, and the Treasury in the US is, as far as I understand it, kind of brim full with recruits from the asset manager sector. It's another one of those kind of revolving doors things, right? Which is that people move in both directions. They move from asset management firms into government policy positions, and then they move back in the other direction as well. So there's a very close link there.
So one of the topics that we've been studying in our group recently is imperialism. And so we were reading Hilferding, Lenin, Luxemburg, the classical theories. And in your book, you do mention Hilferding and Lenin at one point and compare what they were describing was the export of industrial capacity over the globe. Now we seemingly have a rush to privatize infrastructure all over the globe. So what is the character of just the international quality of this? And maybe a more dramatic question, do you see this as a source of future geopolitical conflict, the way that the imperialism kind of led to the world wars? That's maybe a larger topic, but just in general, how do you understand this in the context of the traditional theory of imperialism and international control of economy?
Yeah, well, I think my sort of relatively crude, sort of simplistic take on this is that it is a sort of continuation of a form of financial imperialism in I think much the same way that you could describe the relationship between private sector creditors in the global north and sovereign debtors, obviously in the global south today, and many theorists describe that particular financial constellation in that precise way. I mean, I think the thing, just in empirical terms, the thing that's been particularly interesting, I think, about the period since the financial crisis is that one of the main things you've seen during that period is asset managers who are overwhelmingly based in the global north and who overwhelmingly put to work capital that is raised in the global north, although the growing role of sovereign wealth funds from places like the Middle East as contributors of capital to the funds managed by Western asset managers, it adds a certain important wrinkle to that story. But historically, certainly prior to the financial crisis, it was relatively uncommon for asset managers to invest in housing and infrastructure outside the global north. It happened, investment in hydropower facilities in South America, for example. Brookfield from Canada has long been a big player there, but it really took off after the financial crisis, and I think it took off for a bunch of different reasons. I mean, one of the reasons is that this has become a much more competitive industry, and some of perhaps what might have been kind of easy wins, low-hanging fruit in the whatever metaphor you want to use, that were historically available in the global north, perhaps no longer are. And asset managers, as all capitalists do, once their core markets become more competitive, they look to tap other geographical markets as well. So they've looked further afield. They've begun to explore investing in things like farmland and toll roads, and plus absolutely renewable power on a huge scale outside of the global north over the last decade or so. And then I think the other thing is that they've seen an assortment of parties do more to remove some of the risks or perceived risks that historically put them off that type of investment. So it might have been the case, for example, that 15, 20 years ago, an asset management firm in the global north would have run a mile at the idea of putting money into solar power facilities in Senegal or in Namibia or somewhere else in Africa or in Brazil, for example. But the combination of generous development finance institutions, driven principally out of the global north, and philanthropic institutions, and the willingness of those actors to shoulder the lion's share of any financial risks associated with that investment has been hugely significant in increasing the willingness of asset managers to put money into the global south. And if you believe the kind of the reports by the likes of McKinsey on the global infrastructure gap, and if you believe what they say, which is that an overwhelmingly significant majority of future infrastructure investment has to occur across the global south, and if you combine that need for investment with the very real fiscal constraints under which the majority of governments in those parts of the world operate, then it absolutely doesn't take long to arrive at the fact that asset managers are going to play an enormously significant role in future infrastructure investment in that part of the world, and will be siphoning off the gains and delivering those gains to the extent that they are realized to themselves and to their clients predominantly located in the global north. And it strikes me that to understand that as a form of financial imperialism is makes sense. I would say. Will that lead to geopolitical conflict? Well, I don't think it's any more or less likely to lead to geopolitical conflict than the fact that a huge amount of the expenditure of sovereigns across the global south and parts of the global south today are going to pay interest on sovereign debt that is held by private sector actors in the global north, and that doesn't seem to be generating significant geopolitical conflict today for reasons that I'm no expert on, and so I don't think the types of flows that I've been talking about here are any more or less likely to elicit conflict than they are. But the seeds of conflict would certainly seem to be there, in my view.
Zach, Daniel, have either of you guys have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about sort of similar, but perhaps not international. A good concrete example of some of the conflicts that can arise from this were in your discussion of Chicago. And I found that really interesting. I'd always heard about, the parking meters, but I didn't know all the details. So it was very interesting to discover. And, at one point, I think you use a term, and I'm not sure if it's in the Chicago discussion, but you say there's a structural incongruity. Sometimes the requirements of these companies for a sort of state guaranteed riskless stream of revenue is obstructing the ability of local governments to do what needs to be done, just even to make things work sometimes. And anyone who's driven in Chicago on Lake Shore at 5 o'clock knows that it's chaos, and it doesn't have to be that way. But apparently it's going to be that way for about 80 more years. So I was wondering, can you I mean, this is a case where it seems less speculative and maybe easier to relate to for people. I mean, could you say something about the way that conflict could be baked into these arrangements there, or in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one question I often get asked is what are the limits to the expansion of asset manager society, and those limits can theoretically come in different forms. So one is a drying up of a supply of capital to be invested by their funds. That's for sure one limit. But you would imagine another limit is it entails the willingness of local governments, who you would imagine would be swayed to one extent or another by the concerns of local citizens, to enter into these types of agreements, given the kind of horror stories that previous episodes have elicited. Chicago and parking is one. One of the other examples in the book from New Jersey, the Bayonne and water supply, and the kind of the horrific outcomes that occurred there would be another. So I think that local governments, you would imagine that local governments would in many cases be cautious about entering into these types of agreements, which can lead them to being hamstrung in the way that the city of Chicago has been hamstrung by that particular deal. However, I guess the other side of the equation is to say it's very. I think it is very easy to, and I've seen this in the UK in the municipal context as well, although not specifically in relation to asset managers. I think it's quite easy altogether too easy for local government managers to say, well, that was just a function of poor negotiating on the part of Chicago, and kind of, we know better, and we won't allow ourselves to be taken to the cleaners in quite the same way that Chicago allowed Morgan Stanley to take it to the cleaners, in quite the same way as Bayonne in New Jersey allowed KKR to kind of pull the wool over its eyes. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is that, again, and I know more about the UK case certainly than the US case here, but local governments again are operating under in many cases under very, very severe fiscal constraints, which limits their capacity to pursue other alternatives when it comes to major infrastructure investment. And beggars can't be choosers, right? And so if this is what's on the table, and if you need the investment, then maybe asset managers is kind of what you end up with. But I think I think that is a potential significant source of limits. The fact that a lot of this stuff is very, very visible, right? But at the same time, the world's a weird place. In 2018, Californians had the opportunity to vote to repeal Costa-Hawkins, right, which limits the ability of municipalities to regulate residential rents in California. California has proportionally the most rent-burdened residents in the country. It's just a litany of disaster when it comes to, and 60% of voters voted against the proposition to repeal it, which to me is completely mind-boggling. It's baffling. And I say that because that's a case where the kind of the problems are very visible, and they're experienced on a day-to-day basis by people, and yet people still tend to vote against their own best interests, even where those problems are very, very visible. Which again comes back to lobbying power, financial power. Blackstone was the biggest contributor of capital to the campaign against that proposition, and Blackstone was one of the biggest landlords in the state, right? I mean, it's none of it's surprising.
So with regards to the question of, possible limits to asset manager society, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about just the socialization of risk and the role that plays.
Yep.
Maybe, one of the details I was struck by is when you're describing that, assets are bought so that they can be sold 5 years later at a higher price, and that in itself is one of the higher sources of revenue, even more than rents themselves. And, when you think about this generalized across all aspects of society, whether it's real estate or infrastructure, is like eventually just no one's going to have an incentive to fix anything, and things like society itself is going to break down on a material level. So I just wonder, what examples of just real dysfunction can arise from this, and how that is kind of offset onto to contemporary society.
Yeah, I think the best example I think you can have of something like, it is a bizarre thing, right? And often when they're selling these things after 4 or 5 years, another asset manager comes along and takes it off their hands and holds it for another 3 or 4 years or whatever it might be. And part of me, when I was working on this, it almost felt like I was kind of witness to almost a game where they're like kind of passing a kind of explosive to each other, and they're kind of hoping that it won't blow up during the 4 or 5 years of their tenure, and that they won't be the one that kind of left holding the bag when things blow up. But sometimes it does blow up, right? And I think the best example of that I discuss in the book was a care home chain in the UK, which was passed between, I think it went through about 5 different ownership by 5 different asset management firms within the space of about 14 or 15 years, all of which kind of played the same game of underinvestment, loading it up with debt, And it feels, and it always felt to me when I read those, is they kind of assume that it's not going to be left them that's left, but in that case the problems became so bad that one of them was left holding the bag, and arguably Thames Water in the UK today, although the major shareholders today are pension funds rather than asset managers, it's a similar story in the UK water sector of just ridiculously bad practices, huge debt leveraging of the investments, extraction through dividends and shareholder loans and so on, all the kind of tricks that I discuss in the book. And Thames Water has kind of recently blown up in the face of the investors, albeit, as I said, in this case, pension funds rather than asset managers. So I do think there's that because the business model is buy and sell, and because the business model is essentially sell to another asset manager, it does feel like that someone gets left holding the bag at the end of the day. So the only real question is how long that game can carry on. I mean, I think that asset managers are very good at getting concessions from governments in terms of getting expenditure co-funded and so on. They're very, very good at saying, look, and this is where your question started. Look, we need you to carry out co-investment here. We need public money to help invest in these assets. Otherwise, we're going to withdraw our capital. And they're very, very good at scaring governments with the idea that if governments don't play ball, then capital will flee en masse. And actually, I've probably got a somewhat different views from certain other people who write a lot about this on the left, and because I think that in some cases, capital would flee en masse if the government wasn't forthcoming in de-risking investment. And I think renewables is the best example of that. If you look around the world, if you look at countries that have substantially removed the types of support mechanisms that historically have supported investment in new renewables facilities, investment has collapsed when they've done that, and that's a pretty real sign that de-risking is actually necessary in certain contexts. However, I think there are almost certainly other contexts where governments have been hoodwinked to one extent or another into believing that if they don't carry out that de-risking, the asset managers and other private sector investors won't invest. But I do think that, as you say, I think that there's a certain level of dysfunctionality that we are seeing that you would expect to lead to resistance sooner rather than later. But as I'm constantly amazed by this, governments, but also many people within society seem oddly willing to kind of accept that dysfunctionality. And I think one of the problems here, and this kind of goes, I guess this goes back to the class question, right? Which is that the people whose lives are most embedded in asset manager society, and the people whose financial outgoings go disproportionately to funding the perpetuation of asset manager society are poor people. So on the housing side, we're talking about rental housing, and most wealthy people do not rent, right? So their lives are not affected by the housing question at all. And then on the infrastructure side, the share of household outgoings that go to paying energy bills, transport bills, and public transport bills, and so on, is vastly higher, obviously, for poor households rather than it is for rich households. So it's the rich are relatively less affected by these sorts of dysfunctionalities, and it tends to be rich people's voices who are heard by governments, right? for all sorts of different reasons, not least because they tend to vote more than poor people do. So I think that sort of inequality of impact of asset manager society, and therefore an inequality of kind of the experience of dysfunctionality, is a significant part of the explanation for why it persists in the way it does. I probably need to go in a couple more minutes if that's all right. I'm just had a quick look. I saw the time now, and is it okay if I shoot off in a few minutes?
Yeah, I think we're just coming to an end. Daniel, did you have something you wanted to add?
It looks like you do, Daniel.
Oh,
Yeah.
I do. If you have time, I was just
Definitely
wondering about this term you use, de-risking, and another place you use the expression that there's a sort of guaranteed revenue for these companies by the state. And these are just very striking to me because, in sort of supposing we're in the neoliberal era, we always hear about free markets and the benefits of competition and so forth. But, the impression I got from your book is that asset manager society and neoliberalism, asset manager society might just be a more sort of concrete description of neoliberalism. And it's not free market, it's monopoly, especially the way that all these assets were amassed under these companies after the global financial crisis, when foreclosed homes were bought up really cheaply. And so I'm thinking about things following on the previous comment, like gentrification, rising rents, asset price inflation, the way that, it sounds like they want to be landlords, but they really just want to cut costs to show that high revenue on paper so that they can sell these again. And the consequence is that
100%.
The consequence is that, you have a state-backed monopoly for investments with no risk and guaranteed revenue. And the consequence is that normal people have to pay more rent. So, that's just a wild thought.
No, that's absolutely I think that's absolutely the reality. And I guess so. I wrote a thing in the New Statesman recently where I kind of had a kind of threw a hissy fit about this sort of idea that's increasingly abroad, that we're kind of seeing the end of neoliberalism with the return of industrial policy and everything. And the reason I kind of threw that hissy fit was that I've never really understood the argument, which tends to be the dominant argument, that neoliberalism, which, if we take neoliberalism to be the kind of which I do, to be the kind of political economy of the last 40 years in the global north, is about markets and it's about competition. Rhetorically it is, but the reality is that it never has been. If you look at wherever you look, wherever you look, markets tend to be markets are a very strange phenomenon in reality. They tend to be oligopolistic or even monopolistic, and prices tend to actually have degrees of government control much more widely than people often imagine to be the case. So I made this argument very strongly in the New Enclosure, and I continue to make the argument, I guess, more implicitly these days than explicitly. But for me, at least, the kind of the signature feature of neoliberalism is not markets or competition, certainly not competition, but private ownership and of everything that can be owned and that generates revenue. And I think that's why, what to me is most noticeable about Bidenomics and kind of industrial policy and the return of industrial policy and the alleged death of neoliberalism is that the one thing that isn't changing is the idea that everything that is going to be invested in is going to be privately owned, and there's no significant role for public ownership in any of this. So the idea that it constitutes a significant change, to me, is just misplaced. It's a change for me at the margins, and the fundamental part of it, which is the question of ownership, is not changing at all. And in fact, arguably, it represents a doubling down on private ownership. So I think you're absolutely right, and certainly when I was carrying out the research for the book, the prevalence of those kind of guarantees and the prevalence of the removal of risk from the shoulders of quote unquote risk capitalists is actually quite remarkable. And as I say, the only sort of thing I would add to that is that this is something that I'm working on at the moment, is that I do think that in particular areas like renewables, governments have, if governments have taken the view that the private sector should be leading the energy transition, which they have taken that view more or less everywhere, then they do need to provide those kind of guarantees and subsidies, because otherwise the private sector won't invest because it's not profitable enough. And that's a real problem. If you are expecting the private sector to do something which is not particularly profitable, absent those subsidies, then you have no choice but to carry on giving those subsidies, because the only alternative is public ownership, and that seems to be out of the question right now.
All right, Brett, thank you for talking to us. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me. Thanks for having me.
New book, Our Lives
appreciate
and Their Portfolios, available now. Yeah, we hope to talk to you more in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like that very much. So thanks for having me, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Same to you.
See you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.